Have you ever looked at your life, realized that your habits are slowly leading you down a dark path, but comforted yourself by saying, "Well, it's not that bad yet"? We romanticize the idea of hitting rock bottom, waiting for a massive catastrophe to finally force us to change our ways. But if you are quietly letting your life decay while waiting for a disaster to wake you up, this story will serve as your ultimate warning. Stay with me until the end. Ethan sat at a small wooden table by the window, staring at a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He picked it up, took a sip, and made a quiet face of disappointment, but he didn't stand up to make a new one. Outside, the morning was bright, but inside, everything felt slow, not broken. Not terrible, just slightly off. He reached for his notebook, opened it, and stared at a blank page. He had plans once, clear ones. But now, the days felt soft and shapeless, like warm water around his ankles. Not painful enough to run, not urgent enough to change. That was the problem. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, thinking, "I'll fix things soon. Just not today." Then he closed the notebook. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice asked a dangerous question. "How long have you been saying that? There is a story people tell about a frog placed in water. If the water is suddenly hot, the frog jumps out. But if the water warms slowly, the frog stays until it's too late. No panic, no shock, just a slow, comfortable ending." Ethan stood up, walked to the sink, and poured the cold coffee out. He watched it disappear, dark liquid spinning down the drain. For a moment he felt something, maybe regret, maybe awareness, but it passed quickly. He told himself again, "It's not that bad," and that sentence felt safe. But it was also the trap. Because a life rarely collapses in one moment, it fades quietly, gently, one small compromise at a time. One delayed decision, one ignored signal, and if nothing feels urgent, nothing changes. Let me ask you something. What habit are you allowing to stay in your life just because it hasn't destroyed you yet? Far out in a quiet, endless ocean, there was an island called Cinder. It was beautiful in a calm, ordinary way. Stone paths, small homes, and the soft sound of waves brushing against the shore. Nothing dramatic ever happened there, and that was exactly why people stayed. But Cinder had a secret. Each year the ocean rose, just a little. Not enough to scare anyone, not enough to make the ground shake. Just enough for the water to slowly reach places it had never touched before. At first it covered the edges of the beach, then it slipped into the lower streets. Then quietly, it reached the doorsteps of the homes. And still, no one left. One morning, a fisherman named Loran stepped out of his house and paused. The water brushed gently against his ankles. He looked down, lifted one foot, then the other, as if testing the temperature. Then he shrugged. "It's still fine," he said, walking forward, leaving small ripples behind him. Across the village, people adjusted. They didn't panic, they adapted. They built slightly higher doorways. They wore thicker boots. They raised their furniture by a few inches. Life continued almost exactly the same, just slightly modified. And that made it easy to ignore. In the town square, a young woman pointed at the rising water and asked, "Shouldn't we do something about this?" An older man laughed softly and waved his hand. "Do what? Leave. Why would we leave now?" He tapped his cane against the wet stone. "The water is only at our ankles." The people around him nodded, comforted by the logic. It wasn't denial. It felt like reason. Because nothing had been taken from them. Not yet. Days passed, then months, then years. The water kept rising. Now it reached their shins. Still, the markets opened every morning. Children played, splashing without fear. Music echoed through the streets at night. Life didn't feel like it was ending. It felt normal. And that was the most dangerous part. Because when change is slow, it doesn't feel like danger. It feels like life. One evening, as the sun lowered into the horizon, painting the water gold, a traveler arrived by a small wooden boat. He stepped onto the flooded street and looked around, confusion on his face. "Why is no one leaving?" he asked. A group of villagers turned to him, smiling politely. "Leaving?" one of them said. "Why would we leave? Nothing terrible has happened." The traveler looked down at the water, now swirling gently around his knees. Then he looked back at them, his expression tightening. "But it will." The villagers exchanged glances, then laughed, not cruelly but comfortably. They had heard this before, and they all shared the same quiet belief. We will act when it gets worse. But worse on Cinder never arrived all at once. It arrived inch by inch, and inch by inch. They learned to live with it. Let me interrupt you for a second. If the water in your life is rising right now, slowly, quietly, would you even notice? Or have you already learned to live with it? On the far edge of Cinder, where the land rose just slightly above the rest of the island, there lived a young man named Marcus. His home stood near a quiet line of trees where the ground was still mostly dry and the water had not yet fully taken over the paths. Each morning before the village came alive, Marcus would walk slowly down toward the lower streets, letting the cold water wrap around his feet as he moved step by step, watching more than feeling. He wasn't afraid. He was paying attention. One morning he stopped. He stood there longer than usual, his eyes fixed on the thin boundary where dry stone disappeared under water. The ocean beyond looked calm, almost perfectly still, stretching endlessly under a pale sky. There were no waves, no wind, no sign of danger that anyone could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." But Marcus didn't need a sign. As he looked at the water, gently moving forward inch by inch, something inside him settled into place. Not panic, not urgency, just a quiet, undeniable clarity. Later that afternoon, the sound of an axe broke through the stillness. It echoed through the trees in a steady rhythm as Marcus worked, striking the trunk again and again with calm focus. Wood cracked under pressure, leaves trembled, and time seemed to move with each swing. By sunset, the first tree had fallen, and Marcus was already cutting it into long, usable pieces. He didn't rush, but he didn't hesitate either. Over the next few days, he dragged the logs closer to his home, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground, his hands rough from the work. Slowly, piece by piece, he began building something that didn't seem to belong to the present moment. A boat. It didn't take long for the villagers to notice. One afternoon, a small group walked up the hill toward him, stepping through shallow water, their expressions filled with curiosity more than concern. They watched Marcus work for a moment before one of them finally spoke. "Marcus!" the man called out. "What are you building?" Marcus tightened a rope, checked the frame, and then turned to face them. "I'm building a boat," he said simply. The group exchanged small smiles, the kind people share when something feels unnecessary but harmless. "A boat," another man said. "Why now?" Marcus glanced past them toward the village, where life continued as usual, people talking, moving, adjusting, living as if nothing important had changed. Then he looked back. "Because the water is rising," he answered. A few of them looked down at their feet, where the water moved gently around their ankles, and their expressions softened into quiet reassurance. "It's always been rising," one man said, "but nothing has happened." Another added almost casually, "If there's real danger, we'll know. There will be a storm, something big enough that no one can ignore it." Marcus listened, not arguing, not trying to convince them. Then he asked calmly, "And if it doesn't come like that?" The question lingered for a moment, uncomfortable in a way no one expected. But the answer came quickly. "You're thinking too much," someone said. "You're acting like we've already hit rock bottom." Marcus paused, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I just don't plan to wait for it." There was no drama in his voice, only a decision that felt final. That night, under the soft light of a lantern, Marcus continued building, the quiet sounds of rope and wood filling the air as the boat slowly took shape. He didn't need fear to move forward, and he didn't need disaster to give him permission. He had already chosen his moment. Meanwhile, below the hill, the water kept rising, slow enough to ignore but steady enough to matter, and the village continued to believe they still had time. "So let me ask you honestly," Are you waiting for a clear breaking point in your life before you begin? The change did not begin with a storm. There were no dark clouds gathering in the sky, no thunder rolling across the ocean to warn the people of Cinder that something had shifted. The morning looked like every other morning: soft light, calm water, familiar sounds. And that was exactly why no one noticed it at first. But something was different. The water was no longer just rising. It was moving. At first it came as a stronger push against the streets, small waves slipping past doorways that had once been enough. The villagers stepped outside, looked down, and paused a little longer than usual. There was a slight tension now, something harder to ignore, but still not enough to break their pravichness, their rhythm of waiting. "It will pass," someone said. "It's just a phase," another added. They had said those words before, but this time the water did not settle. By midday, the currents grew stronger, pressing against walls, carrying loose objects through the streets. Wooden chairs drifted slowly past open doors. Barrels knocked softly against stone. The island, which had always felt still, now felt like it was quietly shifting under their feet. For the first time, people stopped adapting. They started reacting. A man rushed out of his home, lifting his belongings onto higher shelves that no longer felt high enough. A woman pulled her child closer as the water reached her knees, her calm expression beginning to crack. Voices rose, not in panic yet, but in confusion. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. Because in their minds, the disaster had always been something clear, something loud, something impossible to ignore from the beginning. They had imagined a single moment, a line they would cross, a signal that would tell them, "Now. Now, you must act." But there was no single moment, only a realization that came too late. By the time the water reached their waists, the island had already changed. The trees they once passed every day stood partially submerged. The paths they knew by heart had disappeared beneath moving water. And the tools they needed, the wood, the time, the energy, were no longer easily within reach. Some tried to build. You could see them struggling near their homes, pulling together pieces of wood, tying weak knots with shaking hands, trying to create something stable in a moment that no longer allowed stability. But their movements were rushed, unpracticed, driven by fear instead of clarity. It showed. The water kept rising, and then for the first time, fear became visible. Not loud, not chaotic, but heavy. The kind of fear that settles in the body when you realize you waited too long. High above them, on the edge of the island, Marcus stood beside his finished boat. He placed his hand against the wooden frame, feeling its strength. The result of days of quiet, consistent work. The same ocean that now terrified the village moved beneath him, but it did not control him. He had prepared before the moment demanded it. As the water surged through the lower streets, people looked up toward the hill, their eyes finally searching for something they had once laughed at. Some called out. Some waved. Some simply stared, caught between regret and disbelief. Marcus didn't speak. He stepped into the boat, untied the rope, and pushed gently away from the ground that was no longer safe. The boat shifted, then steadied, floating on the same water that had taken everything else. Below him, the village was still there, but it was no longer livable. And the people who had waited for rock bottom were now standing in it, not as a clear moment of decision, but as a place they could no longer escape from. Because rock bottom had not arrived all at once. It had been building the entire time. And when it finally became undeniable, they no longer had the strength to begin. The ocean eventually grew quiet again. Not because everything was safe, but because there was nothing left to resist it. Cinder, the island that once felt so stable, so predictable, now existed only as fragments beneath the surface. A rooftop here. A broken wall there. Small reminders of a life that had faded slowly, long before it disappeared completely. And far from that place, Marcus sat in his boat. The water around him was deep and endless, but his hands rested calmly on the wood he had shaped himself. There was no rush in his breathing, no panic in his chest. What he felt wasn't relief. It was understanding. He looked back one last time, not to regret, but to remember. Because the truth was simple, and it had always been there. The island did not sink in a single day. It sank in small, quiet moments that no one thought were important enough to act on. Now let me say something clearly, and I want you to really hear it. My friend, this story is about you. You don't need to lose everything to change your life. You don't need a disaster to give you permission. You don't need the water to reach your chest before you finally say, "This has to stop." Because rock bottom is not a place you fall into. It is a line you decide to draw. Some people draw that line when they lose their health. Some draw it when they lose their relationships. Some wait until everything collapses around them, and only then do they finally move. But you don't have to wait. You can decide that waking up tired every morning is enough. You can decide that feeling stuck is enough. You can decide that repeating the same day again and again is enough. That can be your bottom. And once you define it, everything changes. Because now, you are no longer waiting for a signal. You are becoming the signal. So here are 3 things I want you to carry with you after this story. First, don't wait for the storm. Chatar. If something in your life is slowly pulling you down, that is already enough reason to act. Second, define your own bottom, not based on fear, not based on loss, but based on awareness. The moment you see the direction clearly, that is your moment. And third, Never trust a slow decline that feels comfortable, because the most dangerous trap in life is not pain. It's comfort that quietly leads you somewhere you never meant to go. So take a moment. Be honest with yourself. Where is the water already rising in your life? And, more importantly, how much higher are you willing to let it go? You don't need a perfect plan today. You don't need to fix everything at once, but you can begin one action, one decision. One small step that moves you away from where you know you shouldn't stay. Build your boat early, not because you are afraid, but because you are awake. And if this story stayed with you, if a part of you knows it's time to stop waiting and start choosing, then carry this idea forward, not just for yourself, but for someone else who might still be standing in the water telling themselves it's not that bad yet. Because sometimes the most powerful change begins before anyone else believes it's necessary.